The fantasy football playoffs are just around the corner, and here are my 5 sleepers that you need on your teams if you want to get the chips with the dip, baby. Number 5 is Jonathon Brooks. In the fantasy playoffs, he will see Dallas, Arizona, and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That's the 3rd best, the 8th best matchup, and the 2nd best matchup for opposing running backs. And can you remember who I'm talking about here? Think about it in your brains. Who? Jonathon Brooks? Oh, wait, that Jonathon Brooks. Yeah, that Jonathon Brooks. The Jonathon Brooks that the Carolina Panthers traded up in the 2nd round of last year's NFL draft to make him the first running back off of the board. And that rookie, Jonathon Brooks, he's seen his usage go up in his 2 games as an NFL pro. He had 2 touches in week 12. That number went up to 9 total touches in week 13. That also includes 3 catches for 23 receiving yards in PPR leagues. We obviously love the targets and the catches. Not only that, he was pretty good on the field. He's looking healthier, more explosive. It's starting to look like he is getting back to his old self, the player that we loved at the University of Texas. Now, his teammate Chuba Hubbard has looked fantastic this season. So good, matter of fact. He did get an extension from the Panthers, but he is coming off of the worst game that he's had this season, in which he made a big mistake, a fumble that cost the Panthers the game. Now, I'm not saying that is going to cause Hubbard to be benched or be forgotten about, but it could be that little sliver of hope that Jonathon Brooks can have to see those numbers go up and up and up. And who knows, by the fantasy playoffs, could he have a 45-55 split? Could he have even a 40-60 split? That'll be good enough with his skills and this schedule to be a fantasy sleeper. At number 4, we got my guy Jameis Winston. In the fantasy playoffs, he will square off against the Chiefs, Bengals, and the Dolphins. Now, the Chiefs are a pretty tough matchup this year, but they are coming off a game in which they allowed Aiden O'Connell to throw for 340 yards and multiple touchdowns. After that, they get the Bengals and then the Finns. Those are 2 matchups that Winston can absolutely take advantage of and put up big-time fantasy points. His head coach, Kevin Stefanski, has let him throw the rock. Winston has multiple games this season where he's thrown the ball 45 or more times. Don't get me wrong, Jameis is going to be Jameis. He's going to chuck it. He's going to play a little reckless. And he still does that. But he has shown better accuracy this season than he has at other points in his career. And when you look at his yards per pass attempt, his air yards per pass attempt, and also when you look at how good he's been throwing the deep ball, he's always going to have that chance of throwing 3 or 4 touchdowns in a given game. And when you have a Maverick, and you have some soft matchups, that is the perfect recipe for a Cinderella story in the fantasy playoffs. And that's why Jameis Winston is a sleeper for the 2024 fantasy playoffs. At number 3, we have Ray McCloud. McCloud and the Falcons will take on the Raiders, Giants, and Commanders in the fantasy playoffs. All 3 matchups are in the top 8 softest matchups for opposing wide receivers. And 2 of the 3 games in the fantasy playoffs, they will be played indoors, which is something we definitely like. Not having to worry about the weather in the fantasy playoffs is just it's a little bit of a weight off the fantasy game shoulders, no doubt about it. McCloud has been the primary slot receiver for the Atlanta Falcons this year. Over the Falcons' last 4 games, Ray McCloud has been on the field for more than 90% of the team's snaps. And in 3 of those 4 games, he's finished with 10 or more fantasy points. And over Atlanta's last 2 games, McCloud has seen 12 targets in total. His teammate Darnell Mooney has had a good season, but there's no doubt he's been dealing with some injuries, which has allowed McCloud to step up and step into a role where he's seeing good volume for fantasy football. Playoff sleepers aren't always the guys that go for 30 or more points in the playoffs. Sometimes it's the guy that rock solid flex, a person you can rely on to keep the boat afloat when the studs are taking you to the moon. And that is why Ray McCloud is a sleeper for this year's playoffs. The next player I'm going to talk about is a bit of a deep dive, and I'll admit I had to pivot. The name on the list originally was Isaac Guerendo from the Niners, but since Mason has now hit the IR, CMC is also on the IR, he's not much of a sleeper. He's going to be a fab destroyer. It's not really going to be a sleeper when you're the projected starting running back for the Niners. So, being the professional that I am, I'm pivoting. And I'm pivoting to Juwan Johnson from the New Orleans Saints. In the fantasy playoffs, the Saints will play against the Commanders, the Packers, and the Raiders. All of those matchups are top 12 for opposing tight ends. So the schedule looks good for Juwan Johnson. Now, the Saints do have a very weak receiving hierarchy. There's no Rashid Shaheed. There's no Chris Olave. Those guys are not coming through the door to help them in our fantasy playoffs or help us in our fantasy playoffs for that matter. And now we just got some news. Taysom Hill will miss the rest of the season with a torn ACL. So that receiving core, whether it be tight ends, running backs, receivers, continues to get thinner. That will present an opportunity for a guy like Juwan Johnson. Now, Johnson's been a bit explosive this year, probably even more so than you realize. He's had a lot of explosive plays in this Saints offense, and he has a top 8 ADOT amongst qualified tight ends. So he is in line for some big plays. He has the athleticism and the skill set to convert on those big plays. And in last week, week 13, we saw him see 7 targets. So if you have been streaming tight ends, or if you're just not happy with the tight end and the production from that player, Juwan Johnson might be the sleeper that you need in the fantasy playoffs. At number 1, I'm talking about another Carolina Panther, but this time I'm talking about Adam Thielen. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, the Panthers will play the Cowboys, the Cardinals, and the Buccaneers in the fantasy playoffs. That's the 4th, 11th, and 13th most advantageous matchup for opposing wide receivers. Tampa Bay being the toughest matchup in the fantasy playoffs. Don't worry about it. Big Adam Thielen just went for 24 fantasy points against the Bucs just last week. And since he's returned from injury, he's averaged over 15 fantasy points per game. Despite his wise age, Thielen has still proved that he's got the goods and he can absolutely ball out. You saw that one-handed catch. That thing was amazing. Adam Thielen is not dust yet, and he just keeps showing how he could produce as long as he's getting the volume. And since he's returned, he has seen the volume. And when you have a quarterback playing well, you got the veteran experience that's been producing for us in fantasy for years, and you have a favorable fantasy playoff schedule, well, that's the perfect recipe for the sleeper of the fantasy playoffs.